All right, so got a fairly big crowd tonight, eh? So tonight's session we're doing on the voice, obviously, the voice to Parliament. And before we really get into, I suppose, the nitty gritty of it, a bit about the an overview of what it is. So we'll look at what it is, what will it do, who will it impact. So the voice to Parliament is a proposal at the moment that is aiming to establish a constitutionally enshrined advisory body made up of selected Indigenous leaders. I think at the moment the proposed number is around 24. The aim is to give the government input or recommendations on laws and policies that will affect our communities. So early in the year, Anthony Albanese and the Labor government announced the wording of the referendum, which is a proposed law to alter the constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve of this proposed alteration? So besides that as well, they've also proposed that the Constitution should be amended so that it'll include a chapter titled Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So the details of this at the moment are: in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Peoples of Australia, 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, including its composition, functions, powers, and procedures. So what it will actually do will be to give the government recommendations on laws and policies that affect our communities. It also, the recognition for First Nations people in the Constitution. I think the main thing that we should really look at here is the language around that's being used in the proposed amendment, that it's recommendations. So this isn't, we don't get any power to actually make the submissions, to make the decisions on the submissions, but only that we get to put forward recommendations. The other part of it is that affect their communities. Now, without the defined parameters of what this definition could be applied, it could be taken as that all legislation ultimately made by the government impacts mob and impacts our communities. But without that defined scope, it can go the other way and mean that only legislation that impacts Indigenous communities specifically. The other part of this is that it will recognise us in the Constitution, and that ties into, if you were in the class the other week around sovereignty, self-determination, is a bit of a, goes against that, and we'll talk about that a bit more throughout. On who it will impact, obviously, it's said that it's made for First Nations communities, and that's what we're going to mainly look at tonight, around how it impacts mob. But it's not, as it is currently composed and as we see it, as it has been put out to us so far, that it's not really going to have, it doesn't have that much capacity to make any positive change for us. And for non-Indigenous interests, there's nothing that really impacts them either. So it's, what does it do really for anyone? And that can really be seen as its core function is that it's only an advisory body. There's no power to an advisory body. We're going to look a bit around the historical background. So this is pretty significant. And we're going to look at who first proposed this, what shape has it taken, how has it been formed, why have these reforms been put forward, and when did this campaign first start? Before we get into the nitty-gritty of it though, I want to put these 4 questions forward around who are the architects behind the Voice to Parliament, so who designed it, who came up with it, and who are the main donors and benefactors of this. So if anyone wants to jump in on that.
I know that Rio Tinto is one of the main donors.
Yeah. Yep. I know BHP as well. Actually a number of mining companies, South 32.
Hey guys, can you hear me? It's Roxley.
Yeah.
That too loud? Forgive me, I'm just out here at the tent embassy. Full disclosure, we got you on like big PAs and projectors out here. So if we're worried about like, people listening in, we're literally shouting this at the Parliament right now. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly jump in here and say architects are the voice to Parliament. There's been a lot of them, and it depends what era you're looking at. And this has all kind of been a retaliation from a lot of land rights in Mabo, and where we kind of kicked them in the nuts, they've gasped and looked around and seen trying to work out what they could do. There's traces of this all the way back to the 90s and 80s. You can say that Noel Pearson was dreaming of this in the late 80s. You can say that there was part of it's in the referendum, early in the referendum proposals for Republic in the early 90s. You can really say that it got a giant boost when Noel Pearson and John Howard got together in early 2007. But I think that's a whole section we'll talk about later. And then you can talk about all the ways that they've tried to frame how it's been reintroduced. We've now got like Megan Davis trying to say that it was actually a giant feminist movement because Julia Gillard was the actual architect of it, and it's been this retaliation against men in ATSIC. Meanwhile, at the same time, Noel Pearson will still be promoting the conservative John Howard version of events. They're like oil and water. You never see them in the same room together. When you talk about benefactors, there's basically the Business Council of Australia, consisting of over 500 of the largest companies in Australia, are all up in this. And when every major financial institution in the country is supportive, yeah, that's something to ask in itself. We know it's not revolutionary because when all these businesses support it, it means it's pro-money, and pro-money in Australia is usually at our loss. But yeah, just want to throw that and say hey to everyone. Glad you're all here.
Bloody acres, you're right to say. But no, all of that will be touched on pretty much. Spot on. So the Voice to Parliament goes back a pretty far way. Even though, especially for non-Indigenous people, that this is something that's really only come up for a lot of years. Well, now in the past couple of months, in the past year or so. But as we see it, not from what it actually is, but what it's been marketed as, is that the agenda has been framed as originating from the Uluru Statement of the Heart. And honestly, we could yarn for bloody hours around the Uluru Statement in of itself, but and is being created by mob. But this is not accurate. This proposal is just really the latest tactic that was initiated by the Howard-era government and has been drafted to uphold colonial interests. And I think with the Howard government, he only proposed it because he was about to lose his election, and he'd spent his bloody whole term really getting in a mob and gutting us from ground up and top down. So he really only proposed it to try save skin when the elections were coming around. Massive corporations, big capitalists on this continent have emerged, as well as some of the biggest benefactors and donors like Rio Tinto, BHP, a couple of multinational investment firms who own interest in a range of industries that use our land, uses Indigenous people's land for their primary resources, other conglomerates that hold financial stakes in mining, logging, agricultural industries. And these three in particular have the most conflict with First Nations communities. And we've been fighting them for years. Our ancestors have been fighting them to protect our lands, to protect our waters, sacred sites. And they have the most to stand and the most to gain from First Nations oppression. And they have the most to lose from our self-determination and our land rights. And really, if you think about it, you've got BHP and Rio Tinto as two of the major benefactors. That's a pretty big red flag. Hey, are there any questions on that or comments or anything?
I've got a question about this.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, I'm asking this in good faith as well. In the history of liberal and national parties, they often support mining interests, and that should be a controversial statement to have. But how come the Liberal Party and the national parties are not supporting the Yes campaign, and why didn't the Liberal Party introduce it when they were in power? If it's in the interests of mining, of the mining industry.
Well, I think. Sorry, did you say why didn't they?
Yeah, the question's been why wasn't it introduced while they were in power?
Well, I think
Because I can answer this.
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
Rox can answer this as well, because
Okay.
they actually did try to introduce it, but it kept getting shut down by not just mob, but by trade unions and by a whole bunch of people on the left, because we could see straight through the bullshit. That's why they've come back so many times with so many reiterations of it to try and trick us again and again to try and push it through. As for why they're opposing it now, that's a question I myself have asked. But when we look at the Liberal Party over the last few years, we see that they've been quite disorganized. They've been chopping and changing their leadership. And to put it quite bluntly, they don't know which way's up. So it's no surprise that they've seen something hit their desk that's got the word Aboriginal on it, and their immediate response is to try and shut it down.
I think Kieran's right on that last point, because you can't underestimate what Peter Dutton is actually getting out of this. Just look at Alice Springs at the beginning of the year when Peter Dutton and Albanese got together and worked together quite nicely. Albanese went to Dutton's challenge of seeing the evil Aboriginal children out in Alice Springs. Both of them managed to frame Aboriginal youth and eldership as evil and abusive. They did it right in the week before Invasion Day marches, attempting to delegitimize actual movements speaking out against the voice. And they did that after the marchers had announced their opposition to the voice. Dutton got an instant top up to his $60 million Safer Communities Fund, which they'd already used as a slush fund to armor up a lot of their church donors. They also got a race war across the country. If we're asking why Peter Dutton doesn't support this, it's because Peter Dutton is in bed with a small amount of reactionaries, and he doesn't know any political history beyond the rise of Peter Dutton, because Peter Dutton is a fucking potato. Now, when we look at the history, we've got many bits of footage and quotes of Noel Pearson directly going to Dutton, going, "What the hell are you doing? This is our project." His shadow attorney general had to resign from the front bench the other day in his opposition to Dutton's position, because he wrote half of the legislation for the bloody voice. Recently, we just had a committee inquiry out here in Canberra. We'll be posting bits and pieces of it. It's basically a bunch of Liberal senators and attachés I think they thought they were going to question a bunch of Labor and Greenie types, but it's just conservatives questioning conservatives. And I don't know how we frame Noel Pearson and Megan Davis as land rights leaders. They're lawyers of the most worst kind that have consistently tried to water down our affairs. There's a lot of things that they get out of division, and when it's almost a foregone conclusion, why not milk it for everything it's worth? But yeah.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. I think also you like, we can't underestimate, it's been put forth, at least at this stage, by a Labor government. And it's almost, politics in this poor little country is always tit for tat, and God forbid that Liberal Party's ever seen support in anything that Labor does, and vice versa. But like, even, in its most base form, the voice to Parliament was, drafted, if you will, by the Cape York Institute, which is really just, a bunch of mostly liberals and conservatives.
No,
And
Pearson.
pardon?
I also want to just throw out there, don't underestimate mining's ties across the board here. We got sold out in the native title era, in the Hawke and Keating era, because of Labor's ties to mining interests. When Labor is just obsessed with the worker, and most of the workers are invested in colonial extraction, that means the interests are going to be a little bit tainted. And Labor has always had two veins of history in this country. There's one that's got a little bit of the socialist, internationalist, colonial. The closest it ever fucking came to that was the Whitlam, and that's pushing it. Whitlam era, and that's pushing it. But there's another vein of it that's all been about white workers in the Pacific and protecting the white Australia policy. That was the birth of the Australian Federation, was white Australia and the Labor Party. And the first union jobs were protecting bloody white workers against Chinese and Aboriginal workers. If our worker or socialist revolution out here is dependent on the dispossession of people inside our borders and the enslavement of people outside, then it ain't worth shit. And we've got to fight white imperialism in this area. And this is about reaffirming the Australian Constitution. Why the hell would we be putting something in there when we're trying to rip that document apart? Because it's fucking worthless.
I think as well, if we look at who is, back to that question around who is behind it, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the Referendum Council, if you look at some of the jokers that are on that, you've got, there was, what's her name? Amanda Vanstone, who was a former South Australia senator. You had a business lawyer, Michael Rose. You had the former, this is the funniest one, I reckon, the former president of governance of BHP, Jane McAloon, I think her name was, and the former AFL CEO, and I can't remember his name, Mark something, but he was a business lawyer and CEO of a tax company.
Mark Liebler. He's
yeah.
also the chairman of the Australian Israeli Association.
Yeah. Actually, on bankroll, people who funded this, it was a few weeks ago, there was a an article about different orgs and companies and things and foundations that have funded The Voice. And one of those foundations is the Bezel Foundation. And they've pledged, I think it was 5 million in total, in partnership with a couple of other foundations. But the Bezel Foundation have bankrolled and been responsible for building schools in occupied Palestinian lands. And they've made schools for Israeli students only. So have a look at a couple of those donors. You've got Israel colonialists and imperialists who are, building schools on Palestinian land and making Palestinian and Arab children walk 40 kilometers to reach a school that will accept them when they've built one right in the middle of their neighborhood and made it for Israeli students only. We'll move on to the when and why of this process. I think I'll pose this as questions to use all to answer if you want, around why did these campaigns first begin and when, and was it in response to any particular event or action? This was touched on a bit with the Mabo case, the Howard government with the elections coming up. It was a knee-jerk reaction. And there's been quite a lot, really, but does anyone want to have a shot at these before I get into it? No, that's all good. So in 1992, back onto this with the High Court acknowledging that Aboriginal people have always retained our sovereignty over our lands and waters since the beginning, well before, but especially since colonisation, and that our sovereignty has remained intact. But in saying that, nothing comes out of that, because a judicial body, especially in a colonial state and a colonial government, isn't going to, get rid of itself. It's not going to extinguish itself, or the constitution that that legitimizes and creates its existence. Otherwise, they'd be long gone. And so then this is where the Howard government comes in, along with Pearson, who decides to create a scheme that pretty much abolishes our sovereignty. It's not a Labor initiative like people think it is now. It was always initially a Liberal plan. Really, if you want to say it's, it's by both sides, because there's no, if you want to look at it in its truest forms, it's not really about politics. It's about money, and it's about power, and it's about being scared of black fellas getting our self-determination. Its main author was that Mark Liebler bloke, who is also a dodgy tax lawyer. And as Kieran said, the national chairman of an organization that supports Israeli colonization. There's also, I suppose we'll get into this later, but this initially really started, I believe, back in the 1920s. And every time it's been proposed over the decades, it's always been a reactionary policy. It's always been in reaction to something happening. And the current form, if you will, has been from the Uluru Statement. And before that, it was Julia Gillard. And before that, it was Howard. And it goes all the way back. Any questions on this before we move on? No, all good. So what are the, hang on. Yeah. So we're looking at the history of not just the voice, but of attempts of these types. Does anyone know of any other forms besides the ones that we may have already talked about that this particular kind of campaign has taken, and the history of the advisory bodies that have been set up and failed over the years?
The Recognise campaign was one.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys, I just had to run from one side of the tent to the other. I just quickly want to say something about that last subject. We briefly touched on the fact that there's John Howard and the Northern Territory intervention.
Mm-hmm.
if you really want to look into that one, go look for the transcript of what he said for the Northern Territory intervention on 21st of June 2007, and then go look what he says just 2 months later on the 11th of October 2007 to the Sydney Institute. It's called The Right Time Constitutional Recognition for Indigenous Australians.
Yes, I do.
And it's where he crafts out in very detail the fact of it's time to finally break up this question and sort of like black group rights, and that we need to all be individual Australian citizens, and this is how we can merge us all together. But yeah, it's a horrible read, but give it a go.
I do know what you're talking about. It's particularly with Howard, the first time that he kind of quote unquote proposed it was from that like stance of like, oh, we're all Australians. And then when he was losing the election campaign, that he turned it into a reconciliation campaign about harmony between blacks and whites, which always
We're
makes
about to
me laugh,
talk
to be
about
honest.
this now with the Recognise campaign, but we've really got to sort of see how this has always been and still is about constitutional recognition. And all this campaign, every bit of campaign material, well, 90% of it will always say constitutional recognition through a voice, the way Indigenous Australians have asked. Now, South Australia has legislated and put their voice into action just a couple months ago. You don't need it to be in the Constitution. And I really encourage people also to go look at that legislation, because we have basically the architecture that shows us what the other state models are probably going to be like. And that includes things like the voice only giving like annual and biannual addresses to the parliament. So tell me just how many of our issues we're going to address 2 times a year.
So as you can see, and as I think as we've talked about, every prime minister since Whitlam has established some form of quote unquote Indigenous advisory body. Every state government has formed one over the years. The South Australian one, I think, is the most recent. I think probably, well, up until this point, the most successful, but we'll see how that goes. And every one of them, so if, like, there hasn't been one of them that has addressed our social, political, economic conditions, because there's never been powers behind them. It's always been all talk, no action, really. The specific campaigns, starting with the Constitutional Recognition Campaign, which was about assimilating our people into the Australian Constitution, which was aiming to override and cede our sovereignty as a result. And so then they tried again, which is when the Referendum Council was merged, and the Referendum Council was portrayed as being a First Nations initiative to try and con us into participation, and also have people who weren't aware to what was going on believe that this was a true and genuine First Nations initiative. But it included a lot of non-Indigenous people with those large economic and financial stakes, like the ones that I mentioned before and a couple of other people have mentioned. And then the conference they had was invite only, which is what ended up leading to the current Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Truth, Treaty and Voice process, as is known now. Oops. Any questions before we get on to the next part?
Do we want to unpack anything about those, the campaign for Recognise that led up to Yalara and those consultations? Because they're talking a lot about how much support this has about Indigenous Australia, in Indigenous Australia.
Yeah.
I know that could suck up a lot of time, but do we want to just Do you
I
want me to
reckon-
shoot through some quick statistics about
Yeah,
that?
I know. Maybe a quick rundown because I know. Well, this has been my favorite one that I've seen so far. That there's been a couple of polls that have been released saying things like 80% of Indigenous Australians support a voice to Parliament. And then if you actually look deeper and go out, that a lot of mob don't even know what this is.
Definitely, and the invites that there were on for those consultations, 12 meetings. So that's the one meeting in 12 places. Each one is 100 people per meeting invite only. So when they start breaking down statistics like 60% traditional owners and custodians, 20% important community organizations, and 20% important individuals, that's literally the number of people. A few of the meetings were a bit bigger because people like pushed their way through. They took 10 elected representatives from those meetings to take to the Yalara Convention. So that's 120, which where the Statement of the Heart supposedly comes from, or it does come from. But they go there, and then there's 250 delegates. So you have 120 elected delegates from those community meetings that's already stacked to begin with. And then you've got 130 selected representatives from the Recognition Council. So they'd stacked it all before. And the kind of funny thing is they still got told to shove it because we can't get away from the fact, and I find it really hard to challenge the voice from the heart because the original statement is actually pretty in your face. The sad thing is we don't have the same statement today as we do from that room. It's a hodgepodge, but it was a very polite, go get stuff with your constitutional recognition, give us a representation body, it's got to work towards the sovereign treaty, and we want an international truth commission to nail you to the wall. That's very different to what we got today.
Mm-hmm. I know on that point, and the current voice to Parliament is, I suppose, based off the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which says what's the line? Isn't it time that our voiceless people are heard, which is such, we're not voiceless. We've always had a voice. Just the powers that be, if you will, aren't listening. But with
okay, I was in that building, and I have a bit of a weird ADHD autistic brain. And I can tell you right now that like the feeling in that room, and this was a statement that was being addressed to the Recognition Council, not being drafted by them, because they were like saying to us, you're not going to get anything unless you like come to some agreement today. The main thing everyone realized there was we're not supposed to be there. They dragged us to the middle of the place where they bloody held the intervention and didn't think it was going to rub off on us. And we're like, they're asking us to make this big decision that we are afraid is going to interfere with like sovereignty. And the main ones that pushed it weren't exactly invited, but they managed to sway the audience. And they said, yeah, the first thing we need is an actual body that's transparent and accountable to make these kind of decisions. But the rest of the stuff in there was about holding the government accountable and outside of this process because they can't be trusted to do the work on it because they can't be trusted not to use violence, coercion, manipulation, and stack the deck. And what the heck happened?
I know too, with the consultations, especially on the Uluru Statement, my grandparents were involved. And what ended up happening, and I've heard a couple of other stories from mob about this similar kind of things happening, where my grandparents showed up and they were initially invited, and when they found out that my grandparents weren't gonna lay down and take the new proposed changes to the Uluru Statement, that they closed the doors on him and wouldn't let him in physically, like literally locked the doors on him and wouldn't let him in. And so if you think, the Uluru Statement from the Heart is representative, that it's from mob, that mob's voices are being heard, think about that really. And that's not an isolated incident either.
you've got Megan Davis at the press club here in Canberra bragging that they banned all the leaders of the Indigenous rights movements and all the lawyers. I'm usually not so sad about banning lawyers, but what about our legal advice? What about our political advice? They say that they were giving power to the voiceless and that there was no government interference, but the whole process is set up by IATSIS, which is directly under the wing of Prime Minister and government at the time, and it's all held by land councils, and you can't get an invite unless you're already a registered TO inside the system. And they're saying they're trying to give voice to the voiceless, and I don't know, it's a bit dodgy. But watch those press conferences, and almost everything they talk about is something trying to cover their ass for something dodgy they did. It's very telling.
That's a good segue actually into the next section, around, did Mob ask for this? Is the voice to Parliament in alignment with the demands of other grassroots activists, organisers, campaigners, leaders, TOs and elders? I think you've just heard the answers there. How does the voice to Parliament compare with other campaigns and calls such as treaty, land back, and land rights and self-determination? I think we jumped ahead a little bit, but does anyone else have any thoughts on these questions?
Yeah, I got I suppose a bit more to add to the third point there.
Yeah.
And just that, as was raised in the chat a bit earlier, at the dialogues leading up to the Yulara Convention, they've recently released what was spoken about at these dialogues in a Freedom of Information release, and the BPU have gone through that. And one of the things that we've found is that at these regional dialogues, Mob were actually asking for more stauncher stuff. They were demanding treaties, and they were demanding, not a voice in Parliament. They were demanding actual designated seats in Parliament, so that we would have the power to be able to bring forward our own legislation and vote on our own legislation and stuff. And the way the voice to Parliament now is proposed, it won't give us any of these other things. It's not going to give us self-determination. It's not going to lead to land back on land rights. It's who knows what sort of impacts it will have on the treaty process as well, and how it will co-opt that treaty process to weaken that even further.
Yeah, so pretty much all regional dialogues and really anything that came out of communities and that was that, we're not asking for something this week. We're not asking for a voice. We're not asking to be represented. We're asking that we get change and that we get treaty and that we get our land back and that change actually happens for our people. And every single time we've been spoken over, we've been denied, we've been neglected, and we've been had things like the voice to Parliament put forward for us when none of us have asked for it. When the voice was initially talked about, people said, then, okay, if we're going to have a voice, then it's going to need to have more power than just an advisory body. It's going to have some power on the decisions that actually are made. At the Yulara Convention, people were presented with a blank piece of paper to sign under the provision that it would be filled in later, which is sketchy as. I think also with the proposed referendum wording that we've talked about, and a lot of people have talked about how vague it is and how broad it is. And looking at the history of the Constitution here has been written so that it is vague. And what happens is that if a referendum is passed, that the Parliament fills in the blanks. And that's how referendums have worked thus far. And that really means that this could go any way. If we voted in, the Parliament has free will to do whatever they want with it. And we don't have the power to be able to say, well, no, that's not what was agreed on, or no, that's not what we want, because we've turned around and we've voted yes for something that wasn't even properly established. And so now all of our power, all of our bargaining power, all of our negotiation power with the state goes to the Parliament.
I don't know how all our elders got real good at Zoom in the last couple of years during the pandemic, but the amount of time frame between the Alara Convention and this legislation coming out, this has all been done by a very select work group of inner house people. When Megan Davis talks about we don't want the people with press or the parliamentary passes coming through, she's talking about herself and Noel. They're the ones that have been in control of our affairs for the last 20 years since the land rights movement got kicked out in the ATSIC days. Now, what we've seen in that time is a whole bunch of corporate takeovers. What we see in the architecture of the voice is these different fiefdoms of organizations being given institutional solidarity in exchange for obedience to the system. And when they're talking about it being culturally appropriate, they're basically just saying Noel gets Queensland, Victorian treaty process gets Victoria, and South Australia, legislation's already there. We got a glorified student politics board with fucking king plates, and all of it seems to be directed to not allowing us any power, but using it as a sort of glorified consent model. And that's really scary. And when we talk about the fact that it's really confusing, it's because in the dialogues you see some radical challenges asking for real representation bodies and real seats to parliament and truth commissions and all these things, because they're real in the movement. But what this has done is taken all of that and then vomited it back to us in some kind of serving that not only gives us none of the things we asked for, in many respects, kind of gives the reverse of it. It's a slide, not a small step.
There's I'm just looking at the chat. There's a lot. I think if you're not mob and you're hearing what we're saying, if you're looking at the chat, I think you should hopefully be starting to get it around the BPU stance in particular on the voice to parliament and understand why we take the stance that we do. Continuing on with the Yalara conference as well, it was decided that by an overwhelming vote, and yet again, this is just consolidates and really confirms what mob have been saying for so long, that treaty would be and will be a top priority, and the voice was offered up as a condition of the treaty process. Then after that, in typical fashion, as they could do with the referendum and the constitution, as they have done repeatedly, that the government decided it would skip the first 2 points and move on to the voice component by building it into the constitution, which is really just an attempt to weaken our sovereignty and bargain the position in the lead up to a treaty, and seeing us yet again as domestic entities, which is something that we went over previously in the treaty class. We've never called for this tokenistic quote unquote solution. We've never rallied for the voice. Our ancestors, staunch as, have been fighting against this and have been fighting for our rights of access, of usage, of custodianship of our lands and our waters, the right to manage our own affairs, to have self-determination. And we've never bowed down, we've never gotten on our knees just to have no power. That's not what our ancestors have been about. That's not what we've been about. And to think otherwise is a joke, really.
You ever find it interesting if you read the statement from the heart that the word treaty ain't in it anywhere? What they do have is Makarata, agreement and truth-making process. Now, I guarantee you the original statement, International Truth Commission. Now, the reason we have Makarata inserted in there is because they've just been playing around in Gama, the government board have been playing up in Gama up the top. Now, the Yongu have asked to get that word Makarata stripped from the discussions because it means a very whimsical type thing. It's not a word that you use for this kind of discussion, in the same way that Mududulu mob have asked the Uluru to be stripped from the statement of the hub because they never spent the time and they never signed it there. It should be the sales hotel statement from the hub. Like, and that's what we mean by Yulara. It's like almost half 50, 40 Ks away from the place. I tell you what, when they came into the area, Mududulu did not know they were visiting. The first warning they got of it when they were reaching the outer park borders and coming through the like crossing. 15 minutes later, they get into the community, get out with their cameras, start taking photos everywhere. Some Kiwi Island dancers get out and do the welcome on someone else's country. Some island dancers in the desert. I'm sure that was amusing. And they get back in their bus and they go back to the hotel resort where it's almost some let them eat the cake bougie buffet and some very like attempting to direct the conversation work groups. Half of the people don't go because they think they've just won some resort holiday, and it's like, all right, I'll just go have a swim in the pool. But it was offensive. The fact that they brought us to the place, to the center of the intervention, where Mududulu is still suffering under massive amounts of poverty and neglect, which years later they still haven't fixed, despite now having the responsibility and taken the responsibility. We were stealing like plates of food from the dumpsters out at Yulara and taking it back to Majulu in the shitty bus at the end of each night. Like, and again, like, despite that all, they were against it. They were against the constitutional recognition. Everyone gave a fist pump at that end. If you look in the very back row, you'll see me as the only person without their fists down. And I put my fists up for anything. You'll see me. But I could see them holding the paper and I knew what was going to happen. And sure enough, an hour or two later, we get that blank canvas get rolled out. And everyone's excited, like, yeah, this is going to be great. And they're signing the empty document. And yeah, here we are now.
I think as well, G, or the other G, and Chief Ogola, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, make a really good point around, G said, you know, many government arrangements have been put on hold until the voice is established, which is holding services for mob hostage. And then that Chief has said any organizations whose funding is or are controlled by the government are never free, and every government is occupied by sellouts who only check on how to maintain or die in power, which I think is a really like great summary of what's happening here, yet again with the voice. I think
it's also that the government has for the last 5 to 10 years been designing all the infrastructure to be working into this. So if it doesn't go through, then like they have a problem because the government's been so one-minded in this that they don't have much of an alternative and have to go back to a drawing board. So we're trapped in some real bad decisions here.
Mm-hmm. And the amount of funding they've funneled into this too, they're going to look like a joke, at least in their own eyes. They're going to be the laughing stock of the political world if it doesn't go through.
I'll see it not go through just to see Nolan make bloody cry.
I'm
sorry.
So we'll move on. Sorry, what was that?
I was apologizing for my statement. I'm going to take that as a BPU statement.
So we'll go on to these questions. Yet again, we've already touched on some of these, but so what other examples of similar First Nations advisory bodies? And honestly, just shoot them at me because there's so many that we could probably rack up a pretty hefty list.
National Aboriginal Congress, which was founded in the Little Mirror in response to us kind of getting in the doors here and getting him elected.
Mm-hmm.
Been pretty much one under every prime minister since Whitlam.
Yeah, I know. Julia Gillard had the name, honestly, the expert panel on constitutional recognition. Then after that, because there was nothing came out of that, then they set up the Joint Select Committee, And then I think after the Joint Select Committee, they had the Kirribilli statement.
What we got to sort of understand about the evolution of representative bodies is after the Protection Board got shut down and we see a series of these different departments and representation models, is that the government wing of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs was essentially the rebranded Protection Board. And you had a very adverse government side where we might have had a Congress making good decisions, but then the side that was supposed to rubber stamp it always said no. It took like a decade of international condemnation for all that to get shut down. And then they did ATSIC, and then as soon as Howard got his hands on it, he starts ripping, sort of making that as impotent as possible. One of the biggest mistakes they made with that was making us go on the Australian electoral roll, and what had previously been good turnouts for our mob dropped ridiculously. And it's like we're taking all the worst stitchings of every one of those model and making the most incompetent, impotent, fucking protectionist thing we could. It's ridiculous.
That pretty much sums up just the amount of advisory bodies, and G yet again in the chat said they're sitting on a national policy partnership for a group on languages, and that these things exist and have existed without constitutional recognition. And when you look at the amount of them that have existed without constitutional recognition, you really have to stand back and think, so what is it that they want out of constitutional recognition? And at the end of the day, it's assimilation. It's for us to cede our sovereignty without true consent, so that they can take over pretty much. And it's not, there's really nothing else that comes out of it for us.
Yeah, and there's even as well, people talk about how it'll be protected if it's constitutionally enshrined, but that's not the case either. Because we've had, constitutionally enshrined bodies before, not for Indigenous affairs, but for other affairs, that without referendums have, out of nowhere been defunded, or they've been made defunct, or they've been merged into completely other organizations or bodies at the whim of the government of the day. Because at the end of the day, a referendum doesn't actually set out rights and responsibilities for the people. What it does is gives the government a scope of power that they can choose to operate within if they want to.
I think also you got to understand that although the body might be protected, you as an individual sitting on it are far from protected. Any again, coming from the South Australian model that's already legislated, there are codes of conduct. There is stuff about anything about you bringing any kind of bad press or disrespect on the body, anything about revealing things of commercial confidence. You as an individual sitting on it, you have to jump through more hoops than to get into Parliament, and you have less protections than if you were in Parliament, and you don't get any power or vote out of it. And worse still, they've melded it so you have to stand for it at the same time as the South Australian elections. So you've got a choice. Do you run for the voice where you can just be this token, nice special black, but you're only running with blacks? Or do you actually run for Parliament? Because I don't think you got the power and time to run for two campaigns.
I think that's a good point too around, if we're looking at the people, the mob, the few mob that have made up these bodies so far, that they've always been, the privileged blacks, they've always been mob who have wielded a lot of power and don't have all the time the best interests of mob, of communities, of the grassroots organizations and activists on the ground at heart, and that they do it for their own interests. And on the point around, having only 24-ish people on this voice now, how are you going to represent all mob with only 24 people? And you absolutely know that those 24 mob that are on that board are not going to be people who are, grown up in community, who have been on the ground facing the hardships that mob face. It's going to be the mob who are privileged. It's going to be the mob that don't have the intersections of class and of race and of gender and of disability and all that at heart, and they're not going to be speaking that to the parliament.
And the way they have it structured at the moment, it's a bit of like a student politics ladder climbing. You get on the regional council first. If you're the elected chairperson of the regional council, that puts you on the state council. If you become the elected chairperson of the state council, you're then the national, one of the 12 of the national voice. And I could get into the forms of what it means to stand, but it's basically just making a stat deck that you believe you're Indigenous and that you believe you're local to the area or that you're a registered TO. Yeah, I feel like the best of us won't run and the worst of us will, like you say.
Sorry, what was that? So I think you're breaking up a bit there.
I think Lily's got their mic on by mistake.
Okay. I can, if not, you can turn it back on. That's all good. Yeah, so moving on with these questions and whatnot. So we've had a lot of advisory bodies. And even I can think of probably half a dozen, if not more, off the top. I'm only 20 years old. I can think of half a dozen, yeah, if not more, off the top of my head. And we've talked about a couple of them already. And they've all failed. They've all been about restricting our power and our authority. They've always planted their own actors inside of them with ulterior motives to break down what mob actually want and what mob are actually calling for, and to strip us of our true intentions. And when we've fought back, when mob have fought back and stood up and said, no, this isn't what we want, they've just shut it down and ripped the guts out of it. And every one of them has been so ineffective of doing what they're set up to do, but then the government has been so good at working with its propaganda, with its marketing, with its funding, and with non-Indigenous people being so detached and so consumed by colonial mindsets and imperialism that they can't take a second to step back and understand that what comes out of the government about mob is very often, if not always, propaganda. And so a lot of people do think that the voice to parliament is the first of its kind, or it's something that's radical and progressive. And I think in particular with the voice to parliament, it being proposed now from a Labor government, people have really latched onto that, who see only a two-party system in this style of politics, and see Liberal as right-wing and Labor as left-wing, for those who aren't aware of that they're both just as bad as each other. And so bite onto that and think, well, Labor's putting it forward, so it must be progressive. So we've got ATSIC, which was gutted by Howard. I think he initially defunded it, and then threw a little temper tantrum and decided to get rid of it altogether. There was the Aboriginal Development Commission, the National Aboriginal Conference. All of them are gone now. There's also the state government bodies, Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Advisory Committees, Aboriginal Education Consultancy Groups, Indigenous Advisory Councils. There was also the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee. Even now, the NDIA has just set up the First Nations Advisory Committee. At least they're willing to tell it as it is and say it's only an advisory committee. But this happens over and over, and it's not just on the federal level, it's on the state level. even local governments are doing it now. And then it's within all these colonial government portfolios in the NDIA, in the social services, in justice, in health. And what can we, especially for justice and health and disability, look at that. What can Mob say has come out of that? Nothing. And if anything, things have gotten worse.
And I think if you look at the funding models put out at the moment, you really see that it is just a play group. It's not going to have the power to be making its own sub-commissions that then go and charge into the lobby of Rio Tinto and demand documents. And you're right, we've got all these bodies that they're meant to be listening to. And they're either talking about sidelining them or incorporating their favorite ones into the infrastructure of it. And that sounds like picking who you want to listen to. And the whole point of the thing about building the representation was for us to truly do it in our own way, because institutions like land councils and these government bureaucracies are being framed as our governance institutions, when reality they're just like civic infrastructure, the sort of representations and nice little councils. We've been lacking that for so many years, and it's something we've desperately needed. But yeah, if anything, there's so much of a pressure release valve to this that they want to control the conversation. They want to take out the questioning that we've been drumming up in the streets. And it's usurping our narrative that's been trying to tackle and take down the state and replacing it with something that wants to re-establish and reaffirm the Australian state and constitution. I mean, I'd like to think we'd be out of that document in the next decade, if we were lucky. How's that going to stand for us?
I think as well with the way that all these bodies have been set up to be powerless. And then, as I said before, once we start flexing our power and trying to take that back, that we get dismantled. And I think as well with thinking about how limited the voice to Parliament is, limited in power, that there is, they don't put this out there, but it is in the fine writing if you read it, that we don't have any, obviously we don't have any legal rights, the voice to Parliament, partially due to the separation of powers. So state and judiciary are separate. But there's an amendment also that says that wants to limit the voice to Parliament cannot initiate court reviews. If the voice to Parliament put forward a recommendation and it was a really important one, and the Parliament decided to ignore it and not initiate any kind of action on that recommendation, and the voice to Parliament body turned around and said, well, that's not acceptable, or there's insufficient evidence or whatever, not a good enough reason for why you've rejected this, the amendment would say that the body cannot take the decision to court to have it reviewed. The other part is that there's also quality parameters. This is also in the fine writing that if the body does not have good enough quality to what they are suggesting, to what they are recommending to the Parliament, which is pretty much just another, colonial way of saying we need that neoliberal evidence-based recommendation there, not enough data there, that they can reject the recommendations. And eventually, if they found that there were not enough quality recommendations, that they would be allowed to make the body defunct, essentially. So the few advisory bodies that we have seen that have held power, with I think the biggest one for Mob so far being the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody from 1991, the Bringing Them Home report, and the Australian Human Rights Commission of 1997 have been ignored, and they're being ignored. We know that these bodies that just happens time and time again. And when we look at the stats and the conditions of our people, none of these recommendations have been listened to, and none of them have been put in place. Since the Royal Commission, we have seen Indigenous incarceration rates rise. We see, mob and blackfellas are constantly exposed to the trauma of custody and deaths in custody, even of our young ones. To this day, our people are still being locked up for petty crimes, executed by police or correctional services personnel. The bringing them home report and the national apology, the rates of our children are being removed from homes is as much as it's ever been, myself included in that. And we're well beyond the rates that were ever during the official stolen generations policies, and recommendations haven't rectified this. There's been no fix. The Coalition of Australian Governments and the Closing the Gap report, there are 17 key targets, 11 are not on track, and some have gotten worse, and the other 6 are performing below expectations. And I think off the top of my head, there are only 2 that are on track, and I think it's preschool education and year 12 graduation rates. These are the only 2 targets that are on track. We don't need, I think, as we've said constantly in the chat as well, Aaron, we don't need change in the Constitution to create an advisory board. We have acts that aren't constitutional, but legal acts in place that allow the government to create bodies as it sees fit and as it sees necessary. And constitutionally enshrined bodies are not guaranteed permanency. And I did see a question before about this, that a constitutionally enshrined body in Australia was abolished without a referendum back in 1950. The first constitutionally enshrined body was the Interstate Commission, which was part of the original constitution back in 1901. And the commission was established in 1912, became dormant in 1920, and was eventually abolished in 1950, then to be re-established in 1983, but it was then absorbed into the Industry Commission in 1989, and this all happened without referendums. As discussed in previous classes, constitutional enshrinement does not guarantee a right or a responsibility, and it only allows something to happen if the government of the day chooses to. I think also with the Constitution, some of you may have heard of the races power, which was initially enshrined in the Constitution to curb Chinese and Southeast Asian immigration and refugees into so-called Australia. That since then was turned around, and it has been used time and time again, where it says the races power says that the Australian federal government or the Commonwealth can make special laws pertaining to specific races. That's been turned around and used on mob. The 2007 Northern Territory intervention is an example of that. Howard was a bit sneaky though, and skirted anyone being able to take the decision to court under constitutional breach by only applying it to the Northern Territory and enacting it as a territory law or rule, which means that because it wasn't technically a Commonwealth-based rule, that he didn't technically utilize the race's power. Now, in the voice and out of the Kirribilli statement in particular, and the Joint Select Committee during the Gillard era, there were, and before then as well, but there were numerous suggestions rather, to get rid of this race's power, but not to get rid of it. They wanted to change it so that it was specifically said that special laws can be made for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, they say that it's for. So they propose it as, oh, we'll only make positive laws, we'll only make positive changes that benefit Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. But like, come on, we know, we've seen the racist power be used to unfairly target mob, and we've seen the amount of injustice and violence it causes. And there is no way that a specific constitutional right for the Commonwealth to make laws not about any other races, but only for and or about mob is not going to lead to anything good. We'll move on to the next slide, and this is about the consent. And we've touched on this a bit here and there. And we're going to be looking at, is there a general consensus regarding the voice to Parliament? How does this vary between mob and Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people, sorry, and have mob consented to this process? I'll chuck these questions out to you to answer if anyone would like to have a go. If not, I can talk to it.
I think the whole process, it's G here, I think the whole process has been incredibly violent. And yeah, it's just really characteristic of the colony and how it operates. I think it's caused a lot of conflict between mob, and it's sought to manipulate and exploit mob. Yeah, it's been awful, the whole thing. And then the violence that is being experienced even around the conversation around the voice from racist people as well on social media, and the exposure to that and the experience of that has been absolutely awful throughout the whole process as well. So I just want to point out how incredibly violent the whole process has been for a lot of Aboriginal mob.
It's been difficult, sorry. Jumped head there. So the proposal takes a position of non-Indigenous people knowing what is best for us, yet again, a paternalistic view, and it places us into a category of people who need colonial assistance to manage our own affairs, as if we weren't capable of doing so. It then also invites 98% of the voting population to decide on our future. So that's, all the population that isn't mob, and on affairs that will exclusively impact us. They're voting on something that isn't even going to impact them, but for some reason believe they have a right to have a say on. It's a violation of the UN or the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People. It's a violation of democratic processes that the Australian government claims to uphold. And it's a continuation of the noble savage narrative, saying that mob aren't capable of managing our own affairs and need the white man to look after us. Further to this, the vast majority of mob were excluded from the process, as we've covered a lot. There are hundreds of nations, and yet there are only less than 20 regional dialogues in the lead up to the Illawarra Convention, and around 250 delegates of the conference, which is less than one per nation. That's not even every nation represented. And that's before all the mob that ended up walking out. They're talking about the manufactured consent of this process and what's been happening. So the government has been injecting massive amounts of funding into this campaign, as we've seen, as well as the private donors and benefactors, and has been labeling anyone that's been criticizing or scrutinizing, not from a racist point of view or a right-wing point of view, but from mob who genuinely want better and want to know more about this, as racist or divisive and as stalling progress for our people. They've used tactics such as false misrepresentations of our people's demands, and they wish to imply that this is something that is wanted by the vast majority of First Nations people, encouraging others who might be on the fence or who might not understand the process to also vote yes, which we've seen massively, in particular in remote and very remote communities who don't know nothing about this, but have been spoon-fed lies by the colonial government. The stats in the surveys, yet again, that 80% figure around of 80% of First Nations people supporting this process come from very misrepresented sample groups of 300 people, which is under 0.001% of our communities. And they haven't actually been verified as being First Nations people. We don't know if they're actually mob. We don't know who these people are, which is a conflict of interest, really. And the conflict of interest is the stakeholders of the survey company is also a stakeholder of the Yes 23 campaign, which is pushing for the yes vote for The Voice, and is a writer for The Guardian. I don't know how many of you have looked at The Guardian's articles on this, but they're definitely a bit lopsided. So as a comparative example, so China has a population of over 1.4 billion people. Australia only has a population of 25 million people. And if 1.4 billion people is the same as saying 1.4 million, essentially Australia's population is 2% of China's. Now, if China decided it would hold a referendum on whether or not to annex Australia and make it part of China, but Australians would be allowed to vote as well, would this seem like a fair and democratic process, knowing that 98% of the votes will come from a population who isn't from here, who might not have our interests at heart? Or would this seem unfair? Would this be an unjust proposition? As ridiculous as it is, and as it may sound, it is the equivalent of what is happening here. 98% of the voting population has been invited, not even by mob, but by a colonial government, to vote on affairs which will impact 2% of the population. Even if every single Indigenous person voted the exact same way, what power would it have? If we all voted no, it wouldn't mean nothing, because the population that this doesn't pertain to, that this doesn't have any reason to care about it really, would vote yes, and so we would be overridden. Constitutional recognition has and continues to assimilate mob into the Australian Constitution, or seeks to, and as such legitimize the illegal occupation of our lands by assimilating us into the Constitution of the Australian government. The receives express consent to our lands and their existence, but this is no different to holding a gun to someone's head and having them sign a contract. So everything about this has been coerced. It's been forced. This hasn't been, as Australia government loves to preach, it hasn't been a democratic process. The free, prior, and informed consent is a principle of international law that requires that before any development activities take place on or affecting Indigenous lands, territories, and resources, the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples must be obtained. So the FPIC is recognised as a fundamental right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination and to control their lands and resources. It's enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But yet again, of course, Australia was one of the last signatories to the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, and is one of only 4 nations that still hasn't ratified it, the others being New Zealand, Canada, and the US. The term free means that Indigenous peoples must not be subjected to any form of coercion or pressure when given their consent. It must be given voluntarily and without any external influence. That includes the propaganda that's been handed out in the Yes 23 campaign. Prior means that Indigenous peoples must be consulted and given sufficient time to consider the proposal before any development activities begin. Yet again, we're seeing the Albanese government try as hard as possible to get this to turn around in an incredibly short time frame. Informed means that Indigenous peoples must be provided with accurate, comprehensive, and understandable information about the proposed project or activity, its potential impacts, and any alternatives available. This information must be provided in a culturally appropriate way and in a language that Indigenous peoples understand. At no point during this process have we been provided with this opportunity to consent of our own free will after having proper information. The government has been real closeted, real closed up about this whole process, and is still refusing to clarify what exactly the voice will look like beyond the very brief points they've already made. Yet again, going back to a referendum works by being vague and letting the parliament fill in the gaps afterwards. The points being, those points being on this voice that it will be powerless advisory body whose composition and structure would be at the mercy of the government. Looking at the coercion and duress of this whole process and what the government is doing to mob can significantly affect the validity of consent as they involve forcing and pressuring someone to agree to something against their will. Coercion refers to the use of threats or manipulation to induce someone to give consent, while duress involves force or violence. Both coercion and duress can undermine the voluntary nature of consent, making it invalid. When coercion or duress is present, a party may feel like they have no choice but to agree to the situation, which is particularly problematic for things like contracts or referendums or treaties, where the consent of all parties involved is essential for the interaction to be considered legitimate. It's important to recognise that the Australian government has a long history of coercing Indigenous peoples into accepting policies and proposals that are not in their best interests. This has been particularly through misinformation, misrepresentation, and really treating mob as a child who can't consent, so the parent has to consent for them. The voice to Parliament, yet again, is no exception to this, and many Indigenous peoples and communities have expressed that this proposal is being pushed on them without proper consultations or consent. The government's approach to the proposal has been marked a lot by a lack of transparency and consultation with Indigenous communities. In July 2019, the Indigenous Affairs Minister claimed that the government had consulted widely with Indigenous communities, but we've seen many Aboriginal leaders dispute this claim, and even still, there are videos coming out of many Indigenous communities who haven't even heard of this before. The government's own Indigenous Advisory Council was not even consulted about the proposal before it was announced. Additionally, the government has been actively trying to silence the voices that are critical of the proposal, or as we said before, label them as divisive. And anyone speaking out against the voice is being smeared as a racist or a troublemaker, looking to undermine months and years of hard work by Indigenous communities. This is a really sinister narrative, but it's pretty standard in the playbook of colonial antagonists. Further, the government's own failure to address the structural issues that have caused the marginalisation of Indigenous communities, the band-aid solution that is the voice to Parliament, further reinforces the coercive nature of the proposal, because the government has made clear that they are not willing to implement any practical measures that will ever actually benefit mob. The best that they are willing to do is these advisory boards that don't do shit with no real power, that make non-Indigenous Australians feel good about themselves, while mob continue to die on the streets and in custody for statistical outcomes, the statistical outcomes for all Aboriginal people worsening by the year. We'll look at the narrative that the government has put forward as the voice to Parliament being a progressive policy and a progressive referendum. So the voice to Parliament has been flaunted as a progressive step forward for Indigenous rights, but the proposal as we've discussed, does not address and is a distraction from the fundamental and significant issue of sovereignty. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have never ceded our sovereignty to the Australian government. The history of colonisation in Australia is a history of theft, of exploitation of Indigenous lands, resources and labour. Since the arrival of the British in 1788, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been dispossessed of our lands and resources, and the process of colonisation involved that displacement being violent, of stealing our labour, and the destruction of our cultures and knowledge systems, and the imposition of non-Indigenous laws and systems of governance. This process of colonisation continues on to this day, and we continue to be dispossessed and have our sovereignty and self-determination undermined by the Australian government daily. In short, the British arrived and began a genocide, and it's not finished, it's not ceased. It's still going under the power of the colonial Australian government. By establishing an advisory body to provide Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with a voice, the proposal gives the appearance of Indigenous inclusion and representation in the government. However, this representation is superficial, and it does not address the root causes of our oppression, nor the fundamental issue of our sovereignty. It reinforces the idea that the Australian government and the Australian people have the ultimate say over Indigenous affairs. In essence, the voice proposal is a form of assimilation that it seeks to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the Australian political system. It doesn't recognise the unique cultural, social and political systems, and instead seeks to make us conform to non-Indigenous norms. In effect, it is a form of tokenism that seeks to placate Indigenous peoples without addressing any of the issues that our people actually face. It doesn't provide a pathway for Indigenous self-determination, and it reinforces our dependency on the colonial government. The BPU believes that a voice to Parliament will undermine the sovereignty and self-determination of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and by creating an advisory body that is subservient to the government, the voice will be yet another way for the government to co-opt Indigenous leadership and decision-making to distract from and undermine the real issue of sovereignty. Sovereignty which would give us greater control over our lives and destinies. We believe that the proposal is structurally inadequate. It does not give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples the power to make decisions that affect our lives, and the voice is an advisory body, which means that it can only make recommendations, no enforcement power. This means that the proposal will not give us the power to make decisions, and does not provide a clear process for how the government would engage with the advisory body, nor does it provide any guarantees that the government would take the voice's recommendations seriously. And as we've seen and discussed so far, there has been nothing in Australian history, political history, to suggest that the government would do anything to listen to what mobs say. Ultimately, the Voice to Parliament proposal is a form of neo-colonialism that seeks to maintain the power and the privilege of non-Indigenous elites in Australia. It reinforces the idea that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are a minority group that require government protection and intervention. This perpetuates the colonial narrative that we are unable to govern ourselves and need the guidance of non-Indigenous authorities. The Voice is an attempt by the Australian government to maintain its control over a mob and our territories and our future, and to silence any voices in opposition to the never-ending colonial violence brought upon us. It is a form of co-option that seeks to undermine our resistance and activism by offering us token representation in the illegitimate colonial government to be handpicked by that illegitimate colonial government. We reject this proposal. The Voice to Parliament will not address the ongoing process of colonisation and dispossession, and instead it creates the illusion of progress while allowing the Australian government to continue its theft and exploitation of our lands and resources. So, where do we go from here? We encourage people, including all of you, to vote no, but we also understand that our equality and our liberation can never be given to us through participating in the voting system of the illegitimate state, and that our sovereignty can only be exercised and enforced by us, never handed to us by another entity. The only way true change will come about is through our collective action external to the colonial government. The Voice to Parliament is currently proposed in such a way where we can be sure that the government will make sure they get the final influence over who will actually be members. And the result of this is that the government is going to push through Indigenous voices that align with and agree with what the government is saying. This will echo the interests of the government and their corporate donors, not mob on the ground. And to the average mainstream Australian, this voice approving or taking a softer approach on issues will then create the illusion of general consent amongst the broader Indigenous population and paint any of us who oppose these sentiments and interests the voice to Parliament backs as radical outcasts. Further this, we have seen time and time again, with every concession that we win, how much the reactionary racists and right wing in Australia kick up a storm. They do this while also using those concessions as an excuse to dismiss any calls we have for further progress, all the while lauding the most tokenistic and minor gains over us as if they're our saviours. We see already how many Conservatives are in opposition to the voice, and all for the wrong reasons too. If the voice goes through, it will be another hurdle in our path and another excuse for the worst elements in society to try and obstruct our progress. We've had plenty of voices before. We don't need another reason or a piece of evidence to show that this system is inherently unable to fix its issues and should be overthrown. There has been a plethora already, both in regards to and exclusive of Indigenous affairs. Now is not the time to seek out further confirmation of what we already know tenfold. Now is the time for action, to start those steps to overthrowing the illegitimate state. We discussed our position on treaty a few weeks ago in our treaty class, and for those who couldn't make it, we'll be aiming to upload that class to our website with the rest of the classes on these subjects in the coming days. To give a brief overview though of that, we at the BPU are of the position that we should be forming inter-clan treaties between First Nations of so-called Australia so that we can have the collective strength and power to demand more and to start taking the necessary steps to being in a position where our sovereignty can be something we enforce and act upon. And we can have the power to enforce our rights to self-determination over our lands, our people, and affairs. After a whole lot of talking by me, my apologies. That concludes the lesson and some great yarns too. We've had a fair bit of discussion throughout the class, but if there's any final questions, any final comments, statements, anything like that, now's the time to shoot them over.
Could I just say something about that last summary you had up there on the wall? That was great. And thank you so much for that presentation. That was amazing. Things about treaty pan-national movement. We had a real strong pan-national movement back in the day, and that's where we were really pushing on them. And that's what this has all been about. It's been about dismantling it. We saw it a lot with the native title legislation that pushed us to dance in front of a bunch of academics and anthropologists to prove who we were in our small clans and stopped us fighting as a larger fighting unit. It's why you see a lot of this is basically native title 2.0. It's the right to sit at the table with the mining executives and the companies and then be ignored. It's native title with government. And yeah, that's all I wanted to say. And we're now almost established up here, so give us a call if you need some help.
Anyone else got any questions or anything?
Thanks a lot for your presentation. I did wanted to ask though, if the referendum doesn't get up and the no vote carries the day, are you at all worried that the interpretation is going to not be that the proposal was inadequate, but rather that the majority are going to interpret it as a proposal, as a interpret it as a statement that the proposal was going too far?
Listen, I can't talk for everyone, but of talking for myself, I think that is a concern especially with the way that politics work, and the way that, well, the right wing in Australia works, that a no vote is going to get a voice in the media as that the Australians reject, Indigenous peoples getting our representation and having our rights, or that mob don't want it. We don't want to be represented, or we don't want anything because we're fine and dandy, if you will. But I think in saying that this isn't going to be the last time that something like this happens, and history has reinforced that this is going to keep happening. I'm honestly sitting here now, it's difficult to say. I genuinely can't tell which way the referendum's going to go at this point in time. But if a no vote does go through, yeah, I guess there is some worry about the narrative being co-opted, that it didn't go through because this isn't what mob want, and this isn't this isn't our sovereignty, this isn't our land back, this isn't what our ancestors have been fighting for. But in saying that, that's why the work, for example, that the BPU does is important, because we have to educate people on why things like advisory bodies and committees just don't do it. And I think deep down in the consciousness of a lot of Australians, that they know that. But it's the government that keeps peddling these narratives. How we solve that co-option is a more difficult question, but continuing doing things like this, continuing to work within mob, in between mob, to ensure that treaty, at the very least, is something that builds walls and is strengthened, and that if a no vote does go through, that hopefully a lot of mobs stand up and they say, hey, we didn't vote no because everything's fine and dandy and we don't need anything. We voted no because this is a breach of our human rights. This isn't what mob want.
I just want to reiterate too that we're tearing each other apart in the gladiators a bit, and that's half the point. We've been picked at a time when we're very disunited and that we've been politically decimated. And we've got to prepare ourselves that this is going to be an extremely short time period to mobilize, and no matter what, it's out of our hands. It's up to Australia, and cynically benevolent paternalism could play the part. But no matter what, we got to get back to the idea of get back to what we're good at least one degree. No matter what, on the day that referendum goes through, we got to be on the streets. If it's a yes vote, it's to say that, like, you've made this thing impotent and you're probably not going to listen to it. We're going to be here to make sure you do. And if it's only going to say things to Parliament twice a year, we've got to be proving that we're a better voice than the voice. If it's a no vote, we've still got to be on the streets saying, this is because you did not do the things properly. You wasted $500 million to manufacture our consent. You could have done it with maybe $1 million or $2 million by letting us all sit in the park without beating us up and sitting with us honestly. This is an opportunity to do it better. It might be because Australia is pretty bought off and racist, and that's why you shouldn't have tried to have a vote proving you're not racist. Let's sit down and do it proper. We need to have a proper long conversation, not this short, well, it's not a short push after 20 years, but yeah, we got to sit down and do this properly. And we're here for it. And we got to make space for our mob now. Like, I'm here at the embassy and I want to push the no vote so bloody hard, but I know in the lead up to the referendum, the best counter to their manufactured consent is showing actual conversation of our mob. Because when we sit down, half of us are like, we don't know what the hell's going on. What is going on? Proves that they're full of shit. And it means we got to hold ourselves to make sure we don't kill each other in that pit. And as soon as that referendum hits, we go into action. If anything, the last referendum caused the revolution of the 70s that led to this place. It's because we got sold out and we saw the bullshit. Be prepared for it and know that history goes in waves. Thank you. And yeah.
That's a pretty fine summary, eh?
Thanks, G. You did an amazing job.
Well, if that's all, thank you very much for coming, and hopefully, especially for the non-mob in here, you can go away and
Just-
spread some of the. Yeah, go ahead, Kieran.
Yeah, sorry, just real quickly before we wrap up. If anybody, I've seen a few requests in the chat for like further information and links and stuff like that. If anybody is after like any further info or links or whatever, email the BPU at contact@blackpeoplesunion.org. Just send through like, you know, what it is that you're after and whatnot. And yeah, we'll do our best to provide that info. Yeah, the email's in the chat.
Thank you, Alana. Beat me to it.
Love yous all night from Canberra. It's fucking cold out here.
True God, honestly. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully, we'll see you next time, eh? Sorry, I'll close it in a sec. I'm just responding to a question someone had.